Two young girls in formal outfits stepped into a billionaire CEO's office, holding resumes. Their words soon turned his world upside down. Stephen Carter's office was perched on the highest floor of a sleek glass building in central Chicago, a space where order ruled and distractions were stopped far before reaching his door. That morning began like any other, packed with meetings, a flood of data reports, a financial forecast discussion with his team, and numerous emails demanding absolute perfection. Stephen, the head of Carter and Company, was recognized for his accuracy, sharp decision-making, and remarkable skill in predicting figures before they appeared. Tall, impeccably dressed in a light blue suit, with neatly styled dark brown hair and cool blue eyes that rarely showed feeling, he managed his business like a well-oiled machine. Efficient, rational, unwavering. But that morning, something disrupted the machine's flow. At exactly 10:03 a.m., his assistant Margaret knocked. She only knocked for urgent matters. When she opened the door, her uneasy expression grabbed Stephen's attention more than her words. Clearing her throat, she said, "Sir, two little girls are here to meet you. They claim they have resumes." Stephen blinked. "Did you just say little girls?" Margaret nodded, looking unsure whether to chuckle or worry. "Yes, twins, maybe 7 or 8, identical, blonde, wearing glasses. They're dressed in shirts and ties. They say they're here for a job." He stared at her for a moment, thinking it might be a prank from a competitor or some online stunt, but Margaret's genuine confusion suggested otherwise. "Let them in," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Let's find out what's going on." Within a minute, the heavy office doors opened and 2 small girls walked in, dressed in white dress shirts, red ties, black skirts, and shiny shoes. Their hair was neatly tied into matching ponytails, and they gripped slim red folders tightly. Each wore round glasses. They moved side by side with a focus and seriousness better suited for a courtroom than a corporate tower. Stephen stood, his eyebrows slightly raised. "Girls, are you lost?" One stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "No, sir. We're here to apply for a job." He studied them closely. These weren't just kids playing pretend or seeking attention. They had a rare kind of calm, as if they knew exactly what they were doing and why. He pointed to the chairs across his desk. "Have a seat," he said, almost challenging them. They sat quietly, without squirming. "I'm Stephen Carter," he said. "I lead this company. May I have your names?" "I'm Avery Holland," the first girl said. "I'm Amber Holland," the second added. "What kind of job do you think I have for someone your age?" "We've prepared proposals," Avery said, opening her folder. "Market strategy ideas," Amber continued. "We reviewed your Q2 reports and have suggestions." Stephen's curiosity now outweighed his skepticism. He opened the folder in front of him. Inside were printed pages, colorful charts, simple balance sheets, stock trend diagrams, and a brief write-up proposing a small but smart tweak to Carter and Company's investment strategy. The wording was clear. The calculations were accurate. The ideas were far from childish. "Who helped you with this?" he asked carefully. "Our mom," Avery replied. "She was a financial analyst." Amber added, "She homeschooled us. We've studied economics since we were 4. Stephen swallowed hard. "And where's your mom now?" A brief pause followed before Avery met his gaze directly. "In the hospital. She has cancer. Stage 4, Amber added, her voice just as steady. "We need to help cover her medical bills," Avery said. Stephen felt a shift within him, a quiet ache in his chest. It wasn't just sympathy. It was something stronger, like a sudden understanding. The world seemed to tilt, and he realized he wasn't where he thought he was anymore. He leaned back in his chair. This wasn't a prank. These girls weren't here for show. They were here because their lives had crumbled and someone had taught them that brains, not tears, might be their only way to push forward. In that moment, for the first time, Stephen Carter didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a man facing a choice he never expected to make. Even after the girls left, Stephen couldn't stop thinking about them. The rest of his day blurred. PowerPoint, presentations, and market predictions faded behind the image of Avery and Amber, sitting calmly across from him in their oversized shirts and red ties, talking about portfolio strategies as if it were just another school lesson. Their words, the wisdom in their eyes, the way they spoke in sync without stepping on each other's sentences. It was like they'd trained for years for that exact moment, not to impress, but to survive. Alone in his office long after everyone else had gone, he stared at the folders they'd left. He told himself he kept them for reference, but as he read them again, he knew it was more. Their work, though simple, was genuinely solid. No, not just solid. Insightful. They'd used real company data, mapped out basic market trends, and even suggested backup plans for quarterly shifts. He'd seen grown analysts turn in less thoughtful reports. He opened his laptop and typed their mother's name into his HR database, then checked trusted financial networks. Jenna Holland. She was indeed a financial analyst with a strong reputation. No issues, no controversies. Her last article analyzed consumer spending after the recession. Sharp, clear, convincing. Then her career stopped abruptly. Following the timeline, he saw what the girls hadn't said outright. She'd left her job a few years ago, likely when their father left. Stephen didn't know why it hit him so hard. Maybe because he'd always believed success came from hard work, focus, and determination alone. But these girls had applied all that, not for glory or ego, but because their world was falling apart. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. It wasn't just their smarts that struck him. It was their discipline. Their mother had clearly passed on all her knowledge, but it went beyond academics. She'd given them structure, focus, and strength. The next morning, before anyone arrived, he called Margaret. Find out where Jenna Holland is hospitalized. He said, I need confirmation, and keep it quiet. By 10 a.m., he had the answer. Jenna was in a public hospital on the city's west side. Stage 4 cancer, confirmed. Minimal insurance. No family contacts listed. Only visitors. 2 minors, Avery and Amber Holland. He sat with that information for a long time. There was no one else. No safety net. These 2 girls faced a future no child should bear alone, and they chose to fight it with logic and preparation, not despair. He pictured their small, confident faces and felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. Later that day, he called them back to the office, saying it was to discuss their proposal. He'd set up a conference room with notebooks, colored, markers, a whiteboard, and 2 child-friendly laptops. When they arrived, escorted by security who seemed more amused than worried, they sat down and started working as if it were the most normal thing. Stephen watched from the doorway for several minutes. No playing, no distractions. Avery was reviewing a PDF he'd sent them, marking sections and taking notes. Amber was sketching a bar graph for projected tech sector growth. They weren't pretending to be adults. They were simply doing the work. When he stepped into the room, they looked up, calm and expectant. I've gone over your work again, he said. You clearly understand market basics. But what do you expect from this? Do you think I'll pay you salaries or give you full-time jobs? Avery met his gaze steadily. We expect a chance to learn and show we can contribute. Amber added, we don't want charity. We want to be useful. It wasn't practiced or manipulative. It was honest. That shook him more than anything. These girls were everything many adults around him weren't. Truthful, determined, clear about their goals. He sighed and nodded slowly. Okay, I'll set up a temporary internship program. Unofficial. No pay, but you'll get supervised access to basic analytics, and you'll report directly to me. They nodded together, and a strange warmth filled the room. As he left them to work, He couldn't shake the sense that his life had shifted, subtly, but permanently. He'd made a choice, not just as a businessman, but as something he'd never let himself be, a protector. Deep down, he knew this was just the start. Over the next few weeks, the office began to change in small, quiet ways. It wasn't sudden, and no one spoke of it openly, but everyone felt it. The once cold, sterile atmosphere, filled only with numbers and reports, grew warmer. Where there had been just the rustle of papers and keyboard clicks, now there were soft voices, the patter of small shoes, and the occasional quiet giggle from the far end of the 12th floor. At first, the staff saw the two girls as a passing oddity, a strange, temporary whim of the CEO. But as days turned into weeks, it was clear Avery and Amber were here to stay. Stephen had given them their own space, a glass-walled meeting room near his office. It began as a simple corner with small chairs, a laptop, and some office supplies. Over time, it changed. By the second week, the room had a whiteboard covered in colorful financial equations, handmade posters of bar graphs, and sticky notes with words like equity, diversify, and risk tolerance decorated the walls. Their setup had a clear system. Avery started each day reading economic news, while Amber turned that information into charts or short presentations. They gave each other feedback, fixed errors calmly, and worked more smoothly than some junior analysts Stephen had let go in the past year. He didn't hover over them. He just observed. Between meetings, he'd peek through the glass to see them discussing a spreadsheet or jotting down calculations. Once, passing by unexpectedly, he overheard Amber explaining short-term market swings using sugar packets and a paperclip. Avery quietly corrected her, saying, "That's only true for emotional sell-offs." And Amber adjusted her explanation without pausing. Stephen didn't interrupt. He stood outside, staring, amazed at how children so young grasped ideas that took adults years to learn. More than once, a visiting investor or partner would glance twice at the sight of the tiny interns. Stephen always explained with a calm, brief line, "Temporary research help. Special case." He didn't elaborate, and no one dared ask more. That was the unspoken rule with Stephen Carter. You didn't question what seemed serious to him. Despite their growing presence, the girls stayed quiet and unobtrusive. They were never loud, never asked for anything, and never disrupted the office's flow. In fact, some employees admitted their work improved, if only to avoid looking less capable than the CEO's young protege. It was humbling to see two 7-year-olds calmly analyze revenue trends, while half the boardroom struggled to justify a quarterly drop. What quietly troubled Stephen was how rarely the girls spoke of their mother. They never complained, never sought help, and never used her illness to gain favor. If anything, they worked harder as time passed. The only hint of their struggle came one rainy afternoon when Avery dropped her pencil and bent to retrieve it. For a moment, she paused under the desk. When she stood, her eyes were red, and her hands shook slightly as she tried to write again. Stephen said nothing, but that moment stuck with him like a thorn. Later that evening, after the girls left in the car service he'd arranged, he sat alone in his office. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. He stared at his reflection in the glass, the same polished man he'd been for years. For the first time, he wondered, why did he care so much? These weren't his kids. Their pain wasn't his to carry. Yet, he couldn't stop seeing Avery's sad eyes behind her glasses, too heavy for her age. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he dug into Jenna Holland's case. Her condition had worsened. She was in and out of consciousness, facing a final round of aggressive treatment, likely her last chance. No family was listed, no fallback plan, just two names, Avery and Amber, primary contacts. The girls knew this and carried the burden quietly, showing up daily to work as if they could somehow learn enough or impress the right person to stop their mother's fate. The next morning, Stephen called a private oncologist for a consultation, sparing no cost. He also asked his legal team to quietly explore emergency guardianship options. He hadn't told the girls yet, unsure of what to say, but something had changed in him, and there was no going back. That day, when Avery handed him a new chart on startup valuations, he took it without looking and asked, "Did you eat breakfast today?" They exchanged a confused glance at the shift in topic. "Just toast," Avery said after a pause. "Bagels from the break room," Amber added, as if to lighten the truth. "Come with me," Stephen said, standing. They followed him to the executive kitchen, where he made them sit while he prepared a proper meal: eggs, toast, and sliced fruit. They watched him quietly, almost warily, but when he placed the plates before them, their shoulders relaxed slightly. For the first time since they arrived, Amber gave a small, genuine smile and said, "Thank you." Stephen nodded, but he wasn't sure who he was doing this for. Them, or himself. All he knew was that each day they were there, he saw less of the world he thought he knew, and more of the one they were showing him. Stephen had always believed life was best kept at a distance. From people, from mess, from anything unpredictable. He'd built his empire on control, structure, and a sharp focus on results. But since Avery and Amber walked into his office that strange morning with their red folders and steady resolve, his rules began to blur. A month later, he was no longer the same man. He still wore tailored suits, ran a billion-dollar company, and planned his day to the minute. But between calls and meetings, he worried about the girls' lunches, whether their shoes fit, or if Amber's faint cough was worsening. The girls were changing too, in small, quiet ways. They still arrived early and kept their routines, but their edges softened. They laughed occasionally. Amber started doodling on her notepads, tiny rockets and market charts with smiley faces. Avery, always the more serious one, began asking him questions unrelated to work, like his favorite childhood book or if he believed in luck. He wasn't always sure how to respond, but he answered anyway. One afternoon, after they finished organizing data for a pitch, Avery approached his desk, looking hesitant. She held a slip of paper and handed it to him silently. Stephen unfolded it carefully. It was a hospital visitation schedule. "Our mom," Avery started, her voice unsteady. "She's getting worse. They say we might not have much time. Can we visit her tomorrow?" "We'll catch up on the work later," Avery said. Stephen didn't reply immediately. Instead, he rose, walked to the window, and gazed at the Chicago skyline he'd spent years conquering. For so long, success meant profits, deals, headlines, and global expansion. But now, with two young girls waiting for his permission to visit their dying mother, those things felt less important. "You don't need to catch up on anything," he said, turning to them. "Take the whole day. I'll go with you." They looked at him, startled, as if an adult stepping into their personal world was unthinkable. Amber started to speak but stopped, nodding instead. Stephen caught a brief flicker of relief in her eyes, small but real. The next day, they drove in. Silence. The hospital was stark and clinical, sitting on the city's edge like an overlooked building. Inside, the walls were plain, the lights too harsh. Stephen walked beside the girls, his usual confident stride slower, less certain. They knew the way by heart, as if they'd walked it countless times. Outside their mother's room, they paused. Avery took a deep breath, then opened the door. Jenna Holland looked far older than her online photos. Her skin was pale and thin, her hair nearly gone. Tubes ran from her arms, and the steady beep of machines filled the room. But when she saw her daughters, she smiled. A weak smile, but full of all the strength she could muster. The girls hurried to her side, each taking a hand. For several minutes, there were no words, just the quiet bond between a mother and her daughters who had kept her world intact. Stephen stayed near the door, unsure of his role. Then Jenna looked at him and said, "You must be Mr. Carter." He nodded. "Stephen, thank you," she whispered, "for all you're doing for them." "It's not enough," he said, the words slipping out before he realized their truth. She gave a faint smile. "You're doing more than anyone else has ever tried. That matters." They spoke briefly. Jenna was too weak for more. Before they left, she asked to talk to him alone. The girls hesitated but stepped out, trusting him without needing reassurance. Once the door closed, Jenna said, "I don't know how much time I have left, but I need to ask you something I never thought I'd ask a stranger." Stephen stayed silent, listening. "If I pass before they're old enough to stand on their own, I need to know someone will look out for them. Not just money, I mean care. I need to know they'll be seen, heard, treated like more than a burden." Her words hit Stephen hard, sinking deep into his chest. He wanted to promise instantly, but he understood the weight of what she was asking. It wasn't about contracts or funds. It was about devotion. "I can't take your place," he said softly. "I'm not asking you to," she replied. "I'm asking you to care." He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "I already do." Her eyes closed slowly, as if those words were all she needed. When they left the hospital, the girls didn't ask what their mother had said, and Stephen didn't share. In the car, Amber curled up beside him instead of sitting by the window as usual. Avery leaned her head against the seat, eyes closed, her hand slowly sliding across the leather until it touched his. He didn't pull away. That night, Stephen didn't go to his penthouse. He stayed at the house he'd recently bought outside the city, a place with too many empty rooms, but no longer feeling so lifeless. It felt like something waiting to be filled. For the first time in years, he wanted to fill it with more than numbers or achievements. He wanted it filled with them. In the days after the hospital visit, something changed. Not just in Stephen, but in the girls too. Avery and Amber kept coming early, working with the same focus they always had. But their careful formality began to soften. Small signs appeared. Amber started humming while creating charts, her soft melodies bringing life to the quiet conference room. Avery, usually so precise with her notes, let a doodle of a cat appear on one page's corner. Neither apologized or explained. They didn't feel the need. Stephen began adjusting his schedule. Not drastically, but enough to make breakfast for 3 each morning and leave time to review the girls' latest projects. His staff stopped commenting. Some raised eyebrows, whispering about how the company's coldest man now carried lunchboxes in his car and graded math problems in red pen between meetings. He didn't care. He'd never welcomed disorder. But these girls weren't disorder. They were structure wrapped in unpredictability. Exactly what he'd been missing. One morning, Amber arrived without her usual energy. Her steps were slow, her smile gone. Avery held her hand tightly, guiding her into the elevator with quiet urgency. In their office space, Stephen noticed Amber's usual spark had faded. She sat heavily, placed her folder on the desk, and stared at a blank page without opening it. Stephen approached gently, kneeling to meet her eyes. "Amber?" he asked. "Are you okay?" She hesitated, as if unsure she could be honest, then whispered, "Mom didn't wake up when we visited last night." Stephen glanced at Avery, who stood tense in the corner, staring at the floor without speaking. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling too small. "Do you want to see her again today?" Amber nodded, then shook her head, then whispered, "We're scared it might be the last time." Stephen stood slowly and walked to the window, needing a moment to think. His heart, so used to calculations and strategies, had no plan for this. He turned back and said, "Then we won't wait. We'll go now. I'll cancel everything." Amber looked up surprised. "You can't cancel work." "Yes," he said, grabbing his coat. "I can." They reached the hospital within the hour The air in Jenna Holland's room felt heavier than before. Machines hummed steadily, but her breaths were slower, as if each one was a struggle. The girls took their places by her bed, one on each side, their small hands slipping into hers with familiar care. Stephen stood by the door, uncertain if he belonged in such a private moment. But then Jenna opened her eyes. They were weak, clouded, with pain and medication. But they focused when she saw her daughters. Her lips moved, barely forming words. "My girls," Jenna whispered, and Avery leaned closer. "We're here," Avery said gently, brushing a strand of hair from her mother's face. Stephen took a step forward. Jenna's eyes shifted to him, recognizing him despite her clouded gaze. She moved her fingers slightly, a faint signal, and he understood. She wanted to speak to him again. He bent down by her bed and she murmured, "Have you decided?" He didn't need to ask what she meant. He knew. "Yes," he said softly. "I'll look after them." Her lips quivered and a faint smile appeared. "You already are." Avery and Amber stayed with her for another hour, talking even when she couldn't reply. They shared updates about the stocks they were tracking, their latest report, and how Stephen let them sip hot chocolate in the office kitchen. Jenna didn't speak again, but her eyes glistened with each word, as if she were soaking in their voices. When they left the room, Amber didn't cry. Avery didn't ask what came next. Instead, they turned to Stephen, who stood just behind them, and Avery asked in a voice too steady for her age, "Can we stay with you tonight?" He knelt to meet their eyes and nodded. "Yes, as long as you want, as long as you need." That night, the three returned to the house outside the city. It was the first night the girls officially stayed there. Stephen had their bags brought in, and though the rooms were large, the furniture stiff, and the house too quiet, it no longer felt hollow. He made grilled cheese sandwiches, not because he was skilled, but because he'd looked up a recipe while they napped in the car. They ate at the kitchen counter, their feet dangling above the floor. For the first time since their mother's illness began, they laughed, not loudly, not wildly, but freely. After dinner, they chose the guest bedroom and climbed into the same bed, refusing to sleep apart. Stephen stood in the doorway, watching them snuggle under the blankets. Just before he turned off the light, Avery whispered, "Can you leave the door open?" He paused, then nodded. Of course. As he walked down the hall, he realized none of this was in his plans. But for the first time in years, that didn't frighten him. It felt right. Like the start of something he hadn't known he needed. The morning Jenna Holland passed away was the quietest Stephen could recall. It was early, just past 6:30, when his phone buzzed on the nightstand. He stared at the screen, sensing the news before seeing the hospital's name. The nurse's voice was gentle, practiced for such moments. No complications, no suffering. Jenna had slipped away peacefully in the night, her breaths slowing until they stopped. Her daughters weren't there. Stephen thanked the nurse quietly, his voice steady but tight, and sat in silence for several minutes before rising. He didn't wake the girls immediately. He walked to their room and stood outside, listening to their soft, even breathing. When he opened the door, seeing them, curled under the same blanket, breathing in sync, hit him harder than he expected. He sat on the bed's edge and waited until Avery stirred. She blinked at him, confused but alert, sensing something was wrong before he spoke. Amber shifted, rubbing her eyes and yawning softly. Stephen had no rehearsed words, no polished way to deliver the news. "She passed away last night," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Peacefully, in her sleep, the silence that followed was thick and heavy. Amber's face crumpled first. Her lips shook and her eyes filled, but she stayed quiet. She reached for her sister. Avery hugged her tightly, pressing her face into Amber's neck. Stephen sat still, helpless as they clung to each other and wept. He didn't leave. He stayed beside them, one hand on the blanket, a quiet anchor in their grief. When their sobs faded into exhausted trembling, he gently asked if they wanted to stay home. Avery nodded. Amber didn't speak, but didn't object. The day moved slowly. Stephen canceled every meeting, rescheduled every call, and sent one email to his assistant. Unavailable today. Family emergency. It was the first time he'd used family in that way. He stayed with them, moving quietly through the house, making food they barely ate, playing cartoons they hardly watched. Sometimes, Amber asked about what came next. Funerals. What to wear. Avery asked less. But Stephen knew it wasn't for lack of questions. She was trying to be strong for her sister, and that burden made his chest tighten. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by untouched plates. Stephen leaned forward, searching for words for something bigger than any boardroom deal. "You're not alone," he said simply. "Don't worry about where you'll go or what happens next. You're safe here. If you'll allow it, I'd like to be your guardian. Officially, for good." The room was quiet. The girls glanced at each other. There were no dramatic reactions, no sudden embraces. But Avery blinked quickly and whispered, "She wanted that. Mom wanted that." Stephen nodded. "I know. She asked me before she passed. I promised to keep you safe." Amber looked at him, her eyes red but steady. "Will you still let us come to the office?" He almost smiled. "Only if you keep fixing my spreadsheets." That night, he called his lawyer. Emergency guardianship papers, started days earlier as a precaution, were now essential. Within 24 hours, temporary custody was granted, pending court approval. The next few days were tough, filled with calls, funeral plans, and details no child should face. Stephen protected them from as much as he could, arranging a quiet, tasteful service, just as Jenna would have wanted. Only a small group attended. At the graveside, he stood behind the girls, his hands lightly on their shoulders, grounding them. When the final words were spoken and the casket lowered, Amber reached up and slipped her hand into his. He closed his fingers around hers and held on. That night, after the guests left and the house was dark, Avery knocked on his door. "I don't think I know how to be okay," she said. Stephen set aside the work he wasn't really doing and looked at her. "You don't need to be okay now," he said. "Just keep waking up. That's enough." She stepped inside and sat beside him. After a long pause, she asked, "What if she forgets us?" "She won't," he said without hesitation. "But if you're ever scared she might forget, we'll remind each other every day if we need to." Stephen couldn't pinpoint when it happened, when the girls stopped being a duty and became part of him. Maybe it was the day he let them eat cereal in the conference room. Maybe it was when Jenna entrusted him with their future. Or maybe it started the moment he saw two small girls in red ties across his office and chose to hear them out. All he knew was that grief had woven itself around the three of them, not as an end, but as the painful start of something new, something they'd build together, step by step, day by day, and he'd be there for every moment. Spring came slowly that year, almost timidly, as if unsure how to follow the heavy winter. Mornings stayed chilly, but the air felt fresher, lighter. Trees outside Stephen's house began to bud, tiny green leaves opening with quiet persistence. Sunlight streamed through the windows, no longer feeling harsh. The house stopped feeling like a showroom. It came alive. It carried new sounds. Amber's humming while brushing her teeth. Avery's soft steps heading to the kitchen to make tea. The tap of keyboards in the evenings as they worked on small tasks together at the breakfast table. There were still tough days, moments when grief slipped in like a shadow they couldn't shake, but it no longer consumed them. It lived alongside everything else. At the office, no one questioned their presence anymore. Everyone knew their names. Employees stopped being surprised when the girls joined meetings or quietly sat in on brainstorming sessions. carrying their folders and notebooks like they belonged. Because they did. Stephen gave them real tasks, checking minor reports, summarizing simple trends, joining some internal reviews. Avery had a talent for catching patterns others overlooked. Amber drew clear, simple diagrams that the marketing team found easier to follow than their own. One Friday afternoon, Stephen held a quarterly meeting with investors and department heads. The room was full, suits, charts, and tense air. He'd planned to keep the girls out, not because he doubted them, but because corporate settings could be harsh. But just before the meeting started, they knocked on the boardroom's glass wall. He looked at them, then at the table of skeptical faces, and waved them in. They walked in calmly, took chairs at the side, opened their notebooks, and listened as if it were the most natural thing. Halfway through a talk on market swings, a new financial manager made a prediction based on a weak assumption. Stephen was about to speak when Avery raised her hand. The room went silent. The presenter froze, puzzled. Stephen nodded to Avery. "Your prediction relies on last year's Q3 pattern," she said clearly. "But that was unusual, caused by supply chain issues, not consumer habits. It won't hold this year." A pause followed, then a shift. Heads turned. Someone murmured, "She's right." Stephen let the moment settle, then said, "Go on," as if her comment came from any executive at the table. The meeting continued, but the mood had changed. By the end, no one saw them as a curiosity. They were contributors. After the investors left and the room cleared, Avery looked at Stephen and asked, "Was it okay that I spoke up?" He knelt by her chair. "It was more than okay. You were right. And you were brave." Amber grinned. "I drew the supply chain issue as a dragon eating trucks in our notes." Stephen laughed, a rare open sound that surprised even him. That night at home, they celebrated with pizza and a movie. Amber fell asleep halfway through, curled under a blanket on the couch. Avery stayed awake just long enough to whisper, "Do you think Mom saw us today?" "I do," Stephen said. "And I think she's proud." There were still things to sort out. Legal steps, school changes, grief counselors. But the foundation was forming. Their routines felt like their own, not borrowed. Their place in his home and life no longer seemed temporary. The house now had children's books on shelves, a puzzle always in progress on the dining table, mismatched socks in the laundry, glitter pens in his desk drawer, and a crayon drawing of Stephen the Shark on the fridge. Everything was messier, warmer. Stephen changed in ways he hadn't expected. He stopped working until midnight. He didn't skip birthdays or holidays anymore. He read about child development and asked HR to explore mentorship programs. One weekend, he took the girls to a bookstore, letting them pick 5 books each, then bought 10 more because he couldn't say no when they read aloud in the aisle. One evening, passing their bedroom, he heard Avery reading softly to Amber, who was half asleep. He stood unseen in the doorway, listening. The story was about a girl with a map that kept changing, forcing her to find her way again and again. The metaphor hit him. Grief didn't vanish or become neat overnight, but it left space for joy, love, and healing. The more room they gave it, the less it demanded. By spring's end, he stopped calling them his interns. He called them his girls. When people asked if he had a family, he didn't hesitate. "Yes," he'd say. 2 daughters, unexpected, brilliant, and very much mine. Summer arrived with a calm that felt earned. After months of loss, change, and rebuilding, life for Stephen, Avery, and Amber found a steady rhythm, not driven by tragedy or survival, but by something simpler, softer. Mornings were no longer rushed or hushed by grief. They were filled with clinking cereal bowls, arguments over the last clean spoon, and debates about which tie Stephen should wear. The girls now slept in their own rooms, each decorated in their own chosen colors. Avery's was pale green, lined with bookshelves. Amber's was bright yellow, covered with maps and posters of constellations she wanted to learn. Stephen had transformed in ways he never could have foreseen. He still arrived at the office early, still led meetings with his calm authority, but his days weren't driven solely by profits anymore. He left work early for school pickups. He attended parent-teacher conferences. He signed permission slips and memorized the names of every girl in Avery's chess club and every boy in Amber's art class. His life was now filled with small, meaningful details. Missing buttons, forgotten lunches, handmade cards slipped under his office door. For the first time as an adult, he welcomed these disruptions. When the girl's final custody hearing arrived, Stephen dressed more carefully than for any investor meeting. His tie was slightly crooked, and Amber fixed it silently, standing on tiptoe with steady fingers. They sat in a waiting room filled with families in various states of struggle or hope. Stephen held both girls' hands as they waited for their turn. Amid the chaos, he felt a quiet determination, unlike anything he'd known in a boardroom. This wasn't a deal to seal. It was a promise to make real. The hearing was brief. The judge, a kind woman with silver hair and a voice like aged wood, reviewed the file and asked a few questions. The girls answered calmly. Avery spoke first, describing how Stephen helped with math at night. Amber added that he made the best spaghetti, even if he always burned the garlic bread. Stephen answered questions about Jenna, his commitment, and his plans for their future. The judge smiled softly before saying, "The petition is granted. Guardianship approved." There was no fanfare, no music, just a quiet breath from all three. Avery squeezed his hand. Amber leaned her head on his shoulder. He signed the papers, and just like that, they were a family, not by blood, but by every choice that followed the first. That night, they celebrated in the backyard. Nothing fancy, just pizza, string lights, and a movie projected on the wall. A few of Stephen's closest colleagues came. Margaret brought cupcakes. Even his reserved finance chief showed up with a board game, hiding tears when the girls hugged her. Avery and Amber wore matching dresses they'd chosen themselves. Stephen, in jeans for the first time in years, grilled hot dogs poorly and let them laugh at his clumsiness. As the sun set, Avery stood up and said in a clear, matter-of-fact voice, "Thank you for helping us get here. Mom taught us how to think, but Stephen taught us how to live again." Amber, never big on speeches, grabbed his arm and said, "You're the best dad we could have hoped for." Stephen didn't cry in front of everyone, but later, alone at the kitchen table with a glass of water, he let himself feel it all. Grief, relief, gratitude, love. It overwhelmed him in the best way. He looked at the messy countertop, glitter-glued papers, a stray sock under the chair, and knew this chaos, this joy, this noise, was what life was supposed to be. In the weeks that followed, they built new traditions. Sunday pancakes became a must, no matter how lopsided. They read one book together each month, sometimes a fantasy, sometimes a classic, always with a talk at the end. The office adapted too. The girls had summer desks, and no one blinked. Their presence reminded everyone that even in a world of numbers and deadlines, there was room for humanity. By fall, Stephen stopped calling them his wards, or even just Avery and Amber. He said without pause, "My daughters." When people looked, surprised, he smiled. Not with pride in himself, but in them. They had chosen him as much as he had chosen them. Their lives began in loss, but loss no longer defined them. They'd built something from the pieces, carefully, quietly, completely. In doing so, they all found something they hadn't known they needed, not just healing or safety, but home. In my view, this story's ending isn't just touching, it's deeply significant. It doesn't lean on dramatic twists or big gestures, but celebrates the quiet strength of choice, healing, and found family. What started as an unlikely meeting between a guarded CEO and two grieving, brilliant girls grew into something real and lasting. Stephen didn't plan to become a father. He didn't even know he could love like that. But love came anyway, hidden in matching glasses and red ties, demanding to be recognized. The girls didn't seek a savior. They asked for a chance. And by giving them that, Stephen saved himself too. The ending's power lies in its truth. Family isn't always about blood, but about loyalty, care, and the daily choice to stay. It's not just a happy ending. It's a believable one. It shows that the most unexpected people can become the most vital parts of our lives.